the most hated draft pick in football history, was never convicted of the crime most people think ended his career. Say that out loud to almost anyone who remembers the name JaMarcus Russell, and they will look at you like you've made a factual error. They remember the syrup. They remember the arrest. They remember the word that got attached to him faster than any statistic ever could. Bust. The biggest bust in the history of the NFL draft. But the actual court record tells a different story than the one that calcified into legend, and untangling those two versions is the whole point of what you're about to hear. Look at this photo. January 2007, a towering young quarterback, drenched in confetti under stadium lights, a crowd on its feet screaming his name after the most dominant performance of his life. This is the last time a crowd will ever love him without asking for anything back. By the end of this story, a grand jury will clear him of the charge everyone assumes defined him. A judge, decades later, will rule against him in a case that has nothing to do with football at all. And 19 years after that photograph was taken, he will still be angry enough to threaten a stranger, in profanity-laced fury, on a podcast. This is not a redemption story. It may not have an ending at all. To understand how a legend curdled into a punchline this completely, we have to go back to a shipyard in Mobile, Alabama, and a 20-year-old woman who had just found out she was pregnant. JaMarcus Russell has said, in his own words, that his mother's entire life changed the day she learned she was having him. She was 20 years old. She worked at the shipyard in Mobile, the kind of physically demanding, unglamorous work that keeps a Gulf Coast city running, taking whatever jobs she could find to raise him. Russell has also said that the rest of her family looked very different from that. Doctors, professors, people with advanced degrees, a lineage of achievement running on one side of his bloodline, while his mother worked shift after shift on the other. He grew up inside that gap, a big kid in a working-class house with a family tree that suggested he was capable of something more, if only someone gave him the chance to reach it. Football gave him that chance almost immediately. Mobile sits on the Gulf Coast, a shipping and industrial city that has produced an outsized share of NFL talent relative to its size for decades. The kind of place where a gifted quarterback becomes a topic of conversation at gas stations and church parking lots long before he ever plays a varsity snap. Russell was already bigger than the other kids by the time he reached Williamson High School in Mobile, and he only got bigger from there, filling out into a 6'6" frame with an arm that made grown coaches take notice. For 4 straight years, he never missed a single game. By the time he graduated, he had thrown for more passing yards than any quarterback in the history of Alabama high school football, a state record that still belongs to him today, decades later. He was named the state's Mr. Football. National recruiting services ranked him among the top quarterback prospects in the entire country. In Mobile, he wasn't just a promising athlete. He was already something closer to a local legend, the kind of kid a whole city points to and says, "Watch this one, he's going somewhere." He committed to Louisiana State University over Florida State, arriving on campus in the winter of 2003 as the crown jewel of a nationally ranked recruiting class. And then, almost immediately, reality delivered its first quiet lesson in how little a 5-star ranking actually guarantees you on day one. LSU already had a quarterback. His name was Matt Mock, a 5th-year senior who had fought his way into the starting job through years of patience and injury recoveries, and who happened, by pure coincidence of dorm assignments, to be Russell's roommate that first year. Russell has since described asking Mark directly for help learning the offense, for any kind of mentorship a nervous freshman might reasonably hope for from the guy sleeping 20 feet away. Mark's answer, in Russell's own retelling, was essentially that Russell should figure it out on his own. There was no cruelty in it necessarily, no dramatic betrayal, just the ordinary indifference of a veteran protecting his own job in a room where every extra rep given to a 5-star freshman was a rep he wasn't getting himself. But it meant that from his very first days as a highly touted recruit, JaMarcus Russell learned that talent alone bought him nothing. Nobody was required to make this easy for him. He would have to claim the job, or someone else would keep it. He didn't claim it that year. He redshirted, watching from the sideline as Mark led that same LSU team to an 11-1 regular season and a share of the national championship, beating Oklahoma in the Sugar Bowl to close out the year. JaMarcus Russell has a national championship ring from that season sitting somewhere in a drawer or a display case. He earned it by attending practice every day and throwing route after route on the scout team, contributing nothing the box score would ever record. It is a strange kind of origin story for a future #1 overall pick. His first taste of football's biggest possible reward came entirely from the outside, watching someone else hold the trophy, filing away the lesson that even winning doesn't automatically include you. For a 5-star recruit who had spent his entire life being told he was the best player on every field he ever stood on, that year of invisible labor was its own quiet education in patience, one that would be tested again and again in the years to come, long after the crowds got louder and the stakes got immeasurably higher. The following year brought him closer, if unevenly. By the fall of 2005, Russell had finally claimed the starting job outright, under a brand new head coach named Les Miles in his very first season on the job, and he ran with it. That season would end up defined by something no scoreboard could capture. Days after LSU's opener, Hurricane Katrina tore through the Gulf Coast, flooding New Orleans and forcing LSU to postpone and relocate games, turn its own basketball arena into a makeshift hospital for evacuees, and watch military helicopters circle over its practice fields. According to a widely shared account from a longtime LSU fan writer, the legendary musician Fats Domino, displaced from his flooded New Orleans home, spent part of that chaotic stretch sleeping on JaMarcus Russell's couch, two larger-than-life figures thrown together by a storm neither of them had asked for. Through all of it, Russell led LSU to a 10-1 regular season and captured the Southeastern Conference Western Division title, positioning the Tigers for a top 5 national ranking heading into the conference championship game. And then, for reasons that were never fully or consistently explained to the public at the time, Russell did not play in that SEC championship game against Georgia. He also missed LSU's bowl game that season, watching from the sideline again while backup Matt Flynn stepped in and led the Tigers to a lopsided 40-3 victory over a top 10 Miami team in the Peach Bowl, closing out an 11-win season that Russell had barely finished as its own starting quarterback. What exactly happened behind closed doors that led to Russell's absence from 2 of the biggest games of his sophomore season has never been definitively nailed down in the public record, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. What is certain is the pattern it established. For the second time in 2 years, at a critical moment, JaMarcus Russell was somewhere other than the field, while somebody else got the glory. If that pattern had continued, this would be a very different, much smaller story, one confined to a few paragraphs on a college football message board rather than a legend that would define an entire era of NFL draft coverage. But in 2006, everything Russell had been building toward finally arrived at once, and for one glorious season, the kid from the Shipyard family looked like exactly the generational talent everyone back in Mobile had always insisted he was. Heading into that 2006 season, Russell had 2 obstacles standing between him and the job he had wanted since the day he arrived on campus. Matt Flynn, the same backup who had just won a bowl game in his place, and a highly touted redshirt freshman named Ryan Perrilloux, who many recruiting analysts considered every bit as talented as Russell himself. LSU's coaching staff ran an open competition that preseason, and Russell won it outright. He also made a smaller, almost symbolic change before the year started, switching his jersey number from 4 to 2, as if shedding the uncertainty of the previous 2 seasons along with the old digit. What followed was the best football of his life. LSU went 10-2, and Russell put together performances that made professional scouts start whispering his name in the same breath as the best quarterback prospects in the country. The signature moment came against Tennessee, a fierce SEC rival, in a game that seemed lost. Russell had already thrown 3 interceptions, including 1 returned for a touchdown, numbers that would sink most quarterbacks' confidence completely. Instead, With the game hanging by a thread in the final minutes, he led LSU on a 15-play, 80-yard drive, converting a 4th and 8 along the way, and capped it with a 4-yard touchdown pass with less than 10 seconds remaining on the clock. LSU won by 4. It was the kind of throw away the stat sheet, look at the heart performance that makes NFL front offices fall in love, the exact opposite of the numbers alone. By the end of the regular season, Russell had won the Manning Award, given annually to the nation's top quarterback, and earned first-team All-SEC honors in a conference that year, happened to be loaded with future professional talent. And then came the Sugar Bowl, the stage that would end up defining not just his college career, but arguably his entire NFL fate as well, in ways nobody in that stadium could have possibly predicted. LSU drew Notre Dame, a program with the kind of national name recognition that turns any bowl matchup into an event, and Russell's counterpart that night was Brady Quinn, a Heisman finalist quarterback with his own considerable NFL buzz. It was billed, fairly or not, as a direct measuring contest between two of the best quarterbacks college football had to offer. By the time the clock hit 0, there was no contest left to measure. Russell completed 21 of 34 passes for 332 yards and 2 touchdowns through the air, added another touchdown on the ground, and helped LSU bury Notre Dame 41-14, the most points Notre Dame had ever allowed in a bowl game in the program's storied history. Quinn, by contrast, struggled all night, throwing 2 interceptions of his own. Late in the fourth quarter, with the outcome no longer in doubt, LSU's coaching staff pulled Russell from the game so backup Matt Flynn could get some experience. Russell walked off that field to a standing ovation from the partisan Superdome crowd, named the game's most outstanding player, the unquestioned best player on the field in what was, at that moment, the biggest win of his life. Go back to the photo now. This is that exact moment. The confetti, the noise, the ovation. Understand what that ovation actually was. Total, uncomplicated adoration. The kind reserved for someone who has just given a crowd everything it hoped for and asked for nothing difficult in return. LSU head coach Les Miles, years later, when pressed about how things had eventually gone for Russell at the professional level, chose his words with visible care. He said simply that he had enjoyed having Russell as his quarterback, that Russell had been ready, on time, a leader of his team. Whatever happened after Russell left his program, Miles pointedly said, would be inappropriate for him to speculate on, since he hadn't been there to see it. It is a small, careful quote, but it says something important by what it refuses to say. The man who coached Russell at his absolute peak had nothing but praise for him. The transformation into national punchline happened somewhere else, under someone else's watch. After that Sugar Bowl performance, Russell declared for the NFL draft, and the debate that followed would consume the entire spring. Was he the most physically gifted quarterback prospect in years, a 6'6" frame with a cannon for an arm who had just authored one of the most dominant bowl performances in recent memory? Or was there something underneath the highlight reel that scouts were quietly worried about, some combination of preparation habits and intangibles that the box score could never capture? Two decision-makers within the same organization were about to answer that question in dramatically different ways, and the collision between their answers would set the entire disaster in motion before Russell had even signed a professional contract. The Oakland Raiders held the first overall pick in the 2007 draft, and inside that organization, two men who were technically supposed to be working toward the same goal were about to have one of the more consequential disagreements in modern NFL history. Lane Kiffin was the Raiders' head coach, 31 years old, hired that same off-season, walking into his very first draft with the top pick of the entire league sitting in his lap. Kiffin, by his own much later account, did not want JaMarcus Russell. He wanted Calvin Johnson, the generational wide receiver out of Georgia Tech, who would go on to a Hall of Fame caliber career. Kiffin has said he had already lined up free agent quarterback Jeff Garcia, a veteran, steady, professional presence, to come to Oakland and handle the position instead. In Kiffin's preferred version of that off-season, The Raiders would have walked away with a Hall of Fame receiver and a mature stopgap quarterback, an entirely different foundation for the future. Al Davis, the legendary and famously singular owner of the Raiders, saw it differently. By 2007, Davis had run the franchise for parts of 5 decades, building his reputation on a willingness to trust his own eye over the consensus of his own scouting department, a habit that had produced some of the most memorable players in franchise history, and, by this point in his life, an increasing number of expensive misses that his aging front office seemed powerless to stop. And according to Kiffin's own retelling years later, Davis's evaluation of Russell rested heavily, maybe almost entirely, on a single piece of tape, the Sugar Bowl blowout of Notre Dame, the same photograph you saw at the start of this story. Davis watched a generational talent authoring the best performance of his life against a struggling opponent, and he saw exactly what he wanted to see. Kiffin, according to his own account, begged him to reconsider. Davis did not reconsider. The Raiders selected JaMarcus Russell first overall in the 2007 draft, and Lane Kiffin, the man who would be tasked with actually developing him, was coaching a quarterback he had specifically tried to talk his own franchise out of drafting. There's an odd postscript to Kiffin's side of this story worth noting, if only for how strangely small the football world can be. Kiffin's own head coaching career would go on to wind through USC, Tennessee, Alabama's offensive staff, and Ole Miss over the following 2 decades, a long, controversial, headline-generating journey of its own. In the mid-2020s, that journey eventually delivered him to the head coaching job at Louisiana State University, the very program where JaMarcus Russell had once become a legend. The coach who begged his own franchise not to draft Russell ended up, decades later, running the football program that made Russell famous in the first place. Sit with that for a moment, because it rewrites the entire opening chapter of this disaster. The conventional version of the JaMarcus Russell story treats his NFL failure as a simple morality tale. Talented kid gets rich, gets lazy, blows it. The actual origin is messier and considerably less flattering to the organization that drafted him. Before Russell had thrown a single professional pass, before he'd missed a single meeting or eaten a single extra meal, the man responsible for coaching him into an NFL quarterback had already been overruled on the most important decision of that entire draft, based on a single tape his boss happened to like. Go back to the photo one more time. That ovation, that adoration, happened in a Superdome in New Orleans, against a struggling Notre Dame defense, on the single best night of Russell's football life. It is the exact tape that convinced an aging, legendary owner to spend a franchise's future on a 21-year-old, over the explicit objection of the coach, who would actually have to coach him. This crowd loved him without asking for anything back. The next several years of Russell's life would be entirely about people asking for everything, and an organization deciding, from day one, that the man in charge of the locker room didn't get a real vote in the matter. What followed the draft was its own kind of warning sign, though almost nobody framed it that way at the time. Russell and the Raiders entered contract negotiations that would drag on, missing all of training camp, missing the entire preseason, missing the Raiders' season opener against Detroit. It became one of the longest holdouts by a top overall pick in decades, the lengthiest since a future Hall of Fame running back had simply refused to sign with his drafting team at all more than 20 years earlier, more than 6 weeks of silence broken only by occasional updates that talks remained stalled. The negotiations themselves dragged out for months, precisely because the stakes on both sides had grown so large. Russell's representatives were pushing for guarantee language that would protect the bulk of his money regardless of how he performed, while the Raiders wanted enough performance-based incentives layered into the deal to give themselves some protection if the pick didn't pan out. Neither side fully got what it wanted. When the deal finally came together in September, it landed as a record-setting rookie contract, 6 years, a maximum value of $68 million, once every incentive was included, with guaranteed money reported in the neighborhood of $31 to $32 million, depending on which outlet you believe. It was, at the time, the single richest contract ever given to a player who had not taken one professional snap. That contract would go on to outlive Russell's own football relevance by more than a decade, cited over and over by league executives and reporters as the single clearest piece of evidence for why the NFL desperately needed a rookie wage scale, a hard cap on what unproven players could earn before ever demonstrating they belonged on an NFL field. For years after Russell's release, whenever another highly drafted quarterback struggled to justify his own signing bonus, some columnist somewhere would reach for the same comparison, treating Russell's paycheck as the ultimate cautionary unit of measurement. When the league and its players finally negotiated that scale into the 2011 collective bargaining agreement, dramatically slashing what future top picks could command before playing a game, JaMarcus Russell's name came up constantly in the discussions, not as a person anymore, but as a cautionary statistic, a walking argument for structural reform. Under the new system, a first overall pick would sign a far smaller, heavily incentive-based deal, nothing close to the guaranteed fortune Russell had once negotiated during his holdout. He had become, before he'd even played a full professional season, something bigger and stranger than a football player. He had become a policy footnote, a name lawyers and league negotiators invoked in meetings he was never invited to attend. And missing that entire training camp and pre-season meant something else too, something that would matter enormously and quietly in the years to come. It meant Russell missed the mandatory drug testing window that every other rookie went through that summer. He would not find out for years just how much that single missed test, and everything he did instead during those same weeks, would end up defining the rest of his public reputation. By the time Russell finally signed and joined the team, the season was already underway, and he had lost something no amount of arm talent could get back: the ordinary, unglamorous rhythm of learning an NFL offense from the first day of camp. The team around him wasn't exactly a soft landing spot either. Oakland had finished with one of the worst records in football the year before, and would go on to finish near the bottom of the league again that season, a roster still years away from being competitive, no matter who was throwing the passes. Veteran journeyman Josh McCown had claimed the starting job by default, simply by being the quarterback who was actually present. Russell spent most of his rookie year exactly where a player who missed all of training camp usually spends it, on the bench, absorbing a professional playbook in real time, while everyone around him assumed he should already have mastered it. He finally got his first NFL start in Week 17, the last meaningless game of a lost season, against San Diego. It was a perfectly ordinary rookie debut, nothing embarrassing and nothing spectacular. 23 completions on 31 attempts, 224 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Solid, unremarkable, the kind of first start that for almost any other high draft pick would have been filed away as an encouraging opening chapter. For Russell, given everything hanging over him already, it read more like a modest down payment against an enormous debt. The 2008 season is where the organizational dysfunction that had been quietly simmering since draft night finally exploded into public view, and it happened in spectacular fashion. Lane Kiffin's Raiders stumbled to a 1-3 start, and just 4 games into his second season, Al Davis fired him. What happened next was almost unheard of in professional sports. Rather than issuing a brief statement, Davis called an extraordinary press conference, sat down in front of a bank of cameras dressed in full Raiders silver and black, and proceeded to explain, in exhaustive, almost uncomfortable detail, exactly why he was letting Kiffin go. Dressed head to toe in Raiders silver and black, his face weathered by decades on NFL sidelines, the 79-year-old Davis sat behind a podium lit by a single desk lamp, and read aloud from a letter he had personally written to his own head coach, cataloging Kiffin's failures point by point. He said he had reached a point where he felt the entire coaching staff had become fractured. And in the middle of that extraordinary public airing of grievances, Davis said something that had nothing directly to do with the reasons he was firing Kiffin, but that confirmed everything Kiffin would later claim about that draft night. Davis told the assembled reporters that Kiffin had objected to the team drafting JaMarcus Russell in the first place. Picture what that means for the player at the center of it. JaMarcus Russell, 23 years old, still trying to learn an NFL offense he'd missed the start of, now had to watch his own team's owner confirm, on national television, in the middle of an unrelated coaching firing, that his head coach had never wanted him drafted at all. There was no private way to process that. It arrived as public spectacle, filtered through an aging owner's fury at a coach he'd already decided to fire for entirely separate reasons. Whatever confidence or trust Russell might have been building with his coaching staff took a direct hit, not because of anything Russell himself had done, but because his own employer chose that particular moment, in that particular way, to relitigate the decision that had put Russell in Oakland to begin with. Tom Cable took over as interim head coach that season and would be formally elevated to the full-time job the following year. And it is worth pausing here to name something that the lazy bust version of this story conveniently skips over: an NFL locker room in genuine organizational chaos, 3 different regimes, touching Russell's career within his first 2 seasons, an owner who publicly relitigated his own draft picks, a fired coach who never wanted the quarterback in the first place. None of what came next excuses everything that would follow, but it complicates, considerably, the tidy story that Russell alone was the entire problem. By 2009, Cable's first full season in charge, the wheels genuinely did come off, and this time, in Russell's own later words, there was no single villain to point at. He would eventually describe it as the moment everything he had built in his first 2 seasons in the league simply started to unravel, without ever fully explaining why. What is documented is this: Russell struggled badly through the first 8 games of that season. The Raiders stumbled to a 2-6 record, and after a 38-0 humiliation against the New York Jets, Cable benched him for backup Bruce Gradkowski. For the rest of that season, Cable rotated between Gradkowski, Russell, and a third quarterback named Charlie Fry, essentially running an open competition for a job that had, only 2 years earlier, come with a $68 million price tag attached. Russell would later say he never felt wanted by that particular coaching staff, that both replacement quarterbacks arrived with prior ties to the new regime, and that watching the organization import familiar faces to compete with him felt like being pushed out the door before anyone officially told him to leave. It was during this exact stretch, as his performance collapsed and his benching became a weekly storyline, that the story that would define JaMarcus Russell forever, more than any statistic ever could, first began circulating through NFL locker rooms and eventually into the press. The story goes like this. Suspicious that their bonus baby quarterback wasn't actually studying the game plan materials they sent home with him, Raiders coaches supposedly slipped a blank DVD into the case one week, instead of the usual film. When Russell returned it, he reportedly told them the game plan looked good. It is, without question, the single most repeated anecdote in the entire JaMarcus Russell mythology, the story that gets told every single time his name comes up, as shorthand for professional laziness. There's just one problem with it. Nobody can actually verify that it happened. The story traces back to a former teammate's retelling on a podcast, years after the fact, second-hand and unconfirmed, and even the outlets that repeated it most widely have been forced to add the caveat that its truth was never established. It may be completely accurate. It may be an exaggeration that calcified into fact simply because it was too perfect a story not to repeat. Either way, it tells you something important about how the JaMarcus Russell legend actually got built. Even the single most iconic piece of evidence against him is, at its core, an unverified rumor that nobody ever bothered to confirm before it became gospel. Around that same time, a different rumor started attaching itself to Russell, one with far more serious implications, that he had developed a habit involving codeine syrup, sometimes called scissorp or purple drank, a recreational mixture with a long and troubled history in the Gulf South, associated for years with regional hip-hop culture before it became a tabloid shorthand for athletes accused of losing their discipline. It was the kind of rumor that traveled fast precisely because it fit so neatly into the story the sports media had already half written about him, a once-in-a-generation talent, undone by appetite and excess. This rumor would eventually intersect with real, documented events. But it is worth being precise about exactly what those events did and did not prove, because the popular version of this story blurs that line badly. Oakland released Russell in May of 2010, a little less than 3 years after making him the first overall pick, ending his NFL career after just 25 career starts. His final numbers told their own blunt story: 7 wins against 18 losses as a starter, a completion percentage barely above 52%, 18 touchdown passes against 23 interceptions, 15 lost fumbles, a passer rating of 65.2. By that point, the team had already paid him somewhere around $36 million of his original contract, with roughly $3 million still legally owed. A separate financial dispute followed, with both sides filing grievances against each other, and it would take 3 more years before the matter was finally settled, with the Raiders reportedly paying Russell an additional $3 million to close the book on it completely. Add it all together, and the widely cited total lands somewhere around $39 million earned over a career that produced barely 2 full seasons worth of usable football. Go back to the photo now, for the second time. That crowd, that ovation, that confetti-soaked walk off the field as the best player on it. Compare it to what was happening less than 3.5 years later, a released, unemployed 24-year-old, his name already shorthand for failure, about to become the subject of an undercover police investigation. This is what the story doesn't let you forget. The distance between those 2 moments wasn't decades. It was barely longer than 1 presidential term. 2 months after his release, in July of 2010, Mobile County Sheriff's deputies raided Russell's home as part of an undercover narcotics investigation and arrested him, charging him with felony possession of a controlled substance, codeine syrup, found without a valid prescription. He was booked into the Mobile City Jail and released on $2,500 bond. A sheriff's department spokeswoman told local television that the mixture was typically blended with a soft drink and known locally as Sip Sip, a small, almost quaint detail that got swallowed instantly by the much larger story exploding around it. The story exploded nationally within hours, and it landed with devastating perfect timing, arriving right as the lazy, undisciplined bust narrative was already calcifying in the sports media. Now there was a mugshot-adjacent headline to go with it. The word scissorp started appearing in the same sentence as his name in outlet after outlet, and once that association formed, it would prove almost impossible to unmake, regardless of what actually happened in the courtroom. What actually happened in the courtroom is the part almost nobody remembers. A little more than a month after his arrest, in August of 2010, Russell sat down with ESPN's Colleen Dominguez for an interview on Outside the Lines, and he offered an explanation that complicated the emerging narrative in a way that almost nobody bothered to report, with the same energy they'd used to report the arrest itself. He admitted, on camera, that he had tested positive for codeine back in 2007, shortly after the Raiders drafted him, but he explained the circumstances directly. Because he had missed all of training camp during his holdout, he had also missed the standard drug testing window every other rookie went through that summer. He said he'd had a prescription for the substance at the time, just not one written by a team doctor, which was apparently enough to flag as a violation under league rules. He acknowledged using codeine without a prescription on other occasions as well. But he pushed back hard against the idea that any of this amounted to what people meant when they said he had a drug problem, a phrase he specifically and directly disputed. Sit with the actual sequence here, because it matters. The positive test that seeded the entire scissorp narrative happened in 2007, immediately after the draft, tied directly to the same holdout that had already cost him his rookie training camp. It was not, as the popular legend eventually flattened it into, an ongoing pattern of drug abuse that explained his declining play years later. It was one specific, documented positive test, 3 years earlier than the arrest, that made national headlines, filtered through a young man's own explanation that even he never fully denied using the substance recreationally, while flatly rejecting the idea that this made him an addict. Then came the part of the story that almost nobody remembers at all: what happened to the actual criminal charge. The case dragged through Alabama's court system for months. At a preliminary hearing, a friend of Russell's named Marcus Stevenson testified that he was the one who had mixed the codeine-laced drink found in Russell's bedroom during the raid, not Russell himself. A sheriff's deputy testified that the drink appeared freshly poured and that Russell had told investigators, when confronted, that it was simply his Kool-Aid. The presiding judge expressed skepticism about Stevenson's testimony, but nonetheless sent the case forward toward a grand jury. Russell's defense attorney, Donald Briskman, argued publicly and pointedly that his client was being unfairly singled out, telling reporters that authorities had specifically targeted Russell while ignoring everyone else in the house. 9 people had reportedly been present in the house at the time of the raid, Briskman noted, and Russell was the only one taken into custody, while the codeine bottle itself was found in a cabinet some distance from Russell's own bedroom. He should have been discharged today, Briskman told reporters bluntly. On October 29, 2010, the Mobile County Grand Jury made its decision. It declined to indict JaMarcus Russell on the felony drug charge entirely. His attorney confirmed that no indictment was included in the grand jury's report, meaning the panel had determined there simply wasn't sufficient evidence to move the case forward. The felony charge that had generated national headlines, that had cemented an entire chapter of the scissorp legend in the public imagination, that gets repeated to this day as though it were a settled fact of Russell's biography, ended with no indictment whatsoever. Not a plea deal, not a reduced charge. A grand jury looked at the state's evidence and said it wasn't enough. This is the exact moment where the legend and the legal record permanently diverged from each other, and the legend simply won. The arrest made front-page sports news for days. The grand jury's decision not to indict barely registered as a footnote, a small wire story that most fans never saw, buried under years of accumulated jokes about scissorp that had already hardened into unquestioned biographical fact. To this day, ask a casual football fan what happened with the JaMarcus Russell drug case, and most will tell you, with total confidence, that he got busted for a codeine addiction that helped sink his career. What actually happened is considerably messier. One documented positive test tied to a holdout-related testing gap, one arrest for a substance found in a house with 9 other people present, and a grand jury that ultimately declined to bring any charges at all. Almost every year since his release, some outlet publishes a fresh ranking of the worst draft picks in NFL history, and almost every year, JaMarcus Russell sits at or near the top of that list, usually alongside a photo from his heaviest, least productive stretch, rather than the Sugar Bowl night that actually got him drafted. These lists rarely mention the grand jury. They rarely mention the coach who never wanted him. They simply recycle the same handful of anecdotes, the syrup, the blank DVD, the weight, because those details are vivid and simple and require no further reporting, while the more complicated truth sits quietly in a county courthouse file that almost nobody ever bothers to pull. None of this erases the arrest itself, or the underlying behavior that led police to his door in the first place. This isn't a story about a wrongly persecuted innocent man. It's a story about how a single, contested, ultimately unproven incident got permanently absorbed into a legend that had already decided, well before that summer, exactly what kind of person JaMarcus Russell was supposed to be. And in a strange, almost unbearably human footnote to that entire collapsing 2009 season, buried inside the same Sports Illustrated interview where Russell first tried to explain his side of the story, he mentioned something that almost never makes it into any retelling of his fall from grace at all. It's one thing to lose football games. It's another thing to lose your people. During that same brutal 2009 stretch, the season where his benching became a weekly national storyline, where sports writers were already sharpening the language they would use to describe him for the rest of his life, JaMarcus Russell lost 2 of his uncles within the span of 3 months. He has mentioned it only rarely, almost always as a single aside buried inside a much longer interview about football, never as a headline of its own. Nobody wrote a sympathetic profile about a young man grieving two family members while simultaneously getting benched on national television and mocked as the biggest bust in league history. The football story and the grief were happening in the exact same months, to the exact same 24-year-old, and only one of those threads ever made it into the legend. That same 2011 Sports Illustrated interview, published after Russell had been out of football for a year, contained the other explanation he offered for one of the most damaging stories that had followed him out of Oakland: the persistent reports, repeated by teammates and eventually by the coaching staff itself, that he had a habit of falling asleep during team meetings. Russell's explanation was that he had sleep apnea, a real medical condition involving interrupted breathing during sleep that leaves sufferers chronically exhausted no matter how many hours they spend in bed. He said he'd taken a formal sleep test and been diagnosed. It's worth being honest about the limits of this explanation, the way the rest of this story has tried to be honest about every other claim. The timing of that diagnosis, whether it came during his playing years or only afterward, was never fully clarified in public reporting, and there's no way to independently verify exactly when the condition first affected him. What is verifiable is that Russell offered this explanation directly and specifically, that he continued to hold Tom Cable at least partially responsible for how his final season in Oakland unraveled, and that he insisted his own teammates deserved a meaningful share of the blame for the team's failures as well, not just him alone. None of these explanations undo the very real football failures on the field. A quarterback who completed barely half his passes, who threw more interceptions than touchdowns, who lost his starting job multiple times to backups with far smaller reputations, cannot simply explain away a 7-18 record with a sleep study and a difficult year of loss. But taken together, the sleep apnea claim, the grief over his uncles, the admission about the 2007 positive test, and the grand jury's refusal to indict him on the 2010 charge, complicate a story that the public had already decided was simple. JaMarcus Russell wasn't purely a victim of circumstance. He also wasn't purely the cartoon of laziness and excess that his nickname implied. He was something messier and more ordinary than either version. A young man drowning in a job he'd never been properly prepared for, inside an organization that had fractured around him before he'd thrown a single professional pass, carrying private grief that nobody in the sports media had any interest in reporting alongside his interception totals. By 2013, 3 years removed from his release, and by then 30 pounds heavier than his playing weight, at least according to the reports circulating that winter, Russell decided he wanted to try again. It started, almost comically, as a media story before it became a real football story. Bleacher Report began chronicling his weight loss journey in a multi-part video series, following him through grueling conditioning sessions as he tried to shed the weight that had become, alongside the syrup rumors, the second most reliable punchline in his entire public reputation. He enlisted serious help. Jeff Garcia, the veteran former NFL quarterback, took on the role of throwing mechanics coach and mentor. Marshall Faulk, the Hall of Fame running back, lent his name and his conditioning expertise to the effort. Former LSU teammate Mike Clayton helped organize the whole operation at a training facility called Test Football Academy. He told Yahoo Sports at the time that he still got the itch watching football on television, that the game fed his family, and that people questioning whether he loved football at all made him furious. "I'm committed to this now," he told the outlet. "Tired," he said, "of being written off as a punchline." He dropped weight steadily and visibly over the following months, a public, almost serialized transformation tracked in installments, reportedly around 315 pounds when the effort began, then into the 280s, then, by late spring, reportedly closing in on his old playing weight of 265 pounds. Not everyone in league circles was won over by the physical transformation alone. One respected draft analyst, asked directly about a potential Russell comeback around this time, said flatly that the player simply didn't care about football, that he lacked the passion and the work ethic the position demanded, and that he personally wanted no part of it. It was a blunt, damning assessment from someone paid to evaluate exactly this kind of question, and it captured the skepticism Russell was up against, no matter how much weight the scale showed him losing. He wrote letters to teams, including one addressed directly to Dallas Cowboys owner Jerry Jones, offering to work his way onto a roster from the absolute bottom rung. "I am willing to work my way in and up," he wrote, adding that he would happily serve on the scout team for free for an entire year, just to get back inside an NFL building and prove himself again. It is a startling image. A man who had once signed the richest rookie contract in league history, $3 million still owed to him from a legal settlement, offering to work for nothing at all, just for the chance to be looked at seriously one more time. Garcia himself, asked around this time what actually needed fixing, was careful to separate the physical from the mental. Physically, he said, Russell hadn't lost much from his playing days. The work was mental, getting him back into the habit of thinking football, studying football, being what Garcia called a genuine student of the game, something Garcia wasn't sure had ever really been part of Russell's background at all. It was, in its own polite way, the same core criticism that had followed Russell out of Oakland, just delivered now by someone actively trying to help him, rather than by a locker room source complaining to a reporter. The Chicago Bears finally gave him that look, inviting him for a private workout that spring, alongside 2 other quarterbacks. By most accounts, it went reasonably well. A league source described him as showing a big arm and a good, positive demeanor, with some understandable rust in his footwork and accuracy after 4 years away from competitive football. It was, by any measure, a legitimately encouraging tryout for a player attempting one of the longest odds comebacks in recent NFL memory. Nobody signed him anyway. The comeback quietly died there, the way most of these stories eventually do, not with a dramatic final rejection, but with silence. No other team called. The letters stopped generating workouts. Eventually, the football world simply moved on, and JaMarcus Russell, still only in his late 20s, had to figure out what a life after football actually looked like, when football had never really finished with him on its own terms. What he chose to do with that life, for a meaningful stretch of years, was quietly admirable, in a way that almost never makes it into his public reputation. In 2018, Russell returned to Williamson High School in Mobile, the same school where he'd set the Alabama state passing record more than a decade earlier, and took a position as a volunteer assistant football coach. Unpaid. No headlines attached to it. No redemption arc documentary crew following him around. Just a former #1 overall pick showing up to help teenagers in his hometown learn a game that had given him everything, and then taken most of it back. He held that position for 5 years, longer than his entire NFL career had lasted, working with young quarterbacks who had likely grown up hearing his name used as an insult before they ever understood the context behind it. There is something almost quietly poignant in that arrangement. A man once paid tens of millions of dollars to throw a football, driving to practice for free, in the same hallways where his own name was still spray-painted onto a state record book, trying to hand down whatever he'd learned to teenagers who had no memory of him as anything other than a punchline their older relatives repeated. Then, in the fall of 2023, that quiet second act collapsed too, and this time there was no organizational chaos or unlucky timing to point to as an explanation. According to court documents that would surface the following year, a local mobile business owner named Chris Knowles had agreed, back in July of 2022, to make a donation to help Williamson's football program purchase weight room equipment, after Russell personally approached him about it in his role as a volunteer coach. Knowles wrote a check for $74,000, with football equipment specified in the memo line. According to the lawsuit that followed, that check never reached the school at all. Instead, court records allege, Russell deposited it directly into an account at Navigator Credit Union and withdrew approximately $55,000 of it for himself. When Knowles asked for a receipt documenting the donation and Russell stopped returning his calls, Knowles stopped payment on the check. Mobile County Public Schools quietly removed Russell from his volunteer coaching position that same fall, later confirming to local reporters only that he had been relieved of his volunteer coaching duties, and specifying that he was no longer permitted on the Williamson campus at all. The legal fallout stretched across the following year. In March of 2023, Navigator Credit Union filed suit against Russell, seeking repayment of the roughly $55,000 connected to the deposited check. Russell, notably, did not simply accept the accusation. He filed a counterclaim of his own, suing Knowles and his company directly, arguing that Knowles had made false representations by stopping payment on the check after the fact, and demanding the full $74,000 plus additional damages. His attorney told local news outlets flatly that the entire matter was personal and had nothing to do with the Williamson football program itself. That counterclaim against Knowles was eventually dismissed by agreement between the parties, without ever being resolved on its merits one way or the other. The credit union's case against Russell, however, did reach a resolution, and it did not go his way. In November of 2024, a Mobile County Circuit judge issued a summary judgment against Russell, ordering him to repay Navigator Credit Union roughly $55,000, plus close to $18,000 in the credit union's legal fees and costs. Russell has continued to deny the underlying allegation against him, but the court's judgment stands regardless of his denial, a formal, documented ruling that he owed tens of thousands of dollars connected to a check that was supposed to end up in a school weight room, delivered more than a decade after football had already finished with him. It is worth sitting, briefly, with how strange this particular chapter actually is, compared to everything that came before it. This was not the NFL passing judgment on a struggling young quarterback anymore. This was not a grand jury declining to indict on a contested drug charge, or a coach who never wanted him in the first place, or a Hall of Fame owner blaming a rookie for problems the whole organization had created. This was a civil court in his own hometown, ruling against him in a dispute with a local credit union, an entry on the record with no organizational chaos to point to as an explanation. Some chapters of this story genuinely complicate the legend that swallowed him. This one does not offer that same comfort. It simply adds another entry to a very long list, one that had already grown far too long before he ever set foot back on that Williamson practice field as a volunteer. And then, in the spring of 2026, 19 years almost to the month after that draft night decision that started everything, the entire story found an almost unbearably neat way to circle back on itself. In April of 2026, the Las Vegas Raiders found themselves holding the first overall pick in the NFL draft once again, the franchise's first return to that exact position since the spring of 2007. The organization had a new general manager, a new head coach, an entirely new era built around players who were, in some cases, not even born yet when JaMarcus Russell walked off that Sugar Bowl field to a standing ovation. This time, the presumed favorite for that top selection was a college quarterback out of Indiana, another highly touted arm about to walk into the exact same spotlight that had swallowed Russell whole 19 years earlier. And when a reporter asked current owner Mark Davis, son of the late Al Davis, how it felt to be sitting at the top of the draft board again, he could not get through his answer without invoking the exact history this entire story has spent the last hour unpacking. He talked about how exciting it was to control the very top of the draft board, then immediately, unprompted, acknowledged that the organization had been in this exact position before, and it hadn't worked out. "There's no magic bullet," he said. 19 years later, the name JaMarcus Russell didn't even need to be spoken out loud. Everyone in that press room understood exactly which cautionary tale the new owner was quietly referencing. Russell heard about it. Or maybe he'd simply had enough silence by then, nearly 2 decades of being invoked as a punchline every time his old franchise found itself picking first again. Whatever triggered it, within days of that press conference, JaMarcus Russell appeared on a podcast and finally let loose everything he had apparently been holding back for years. He did not offer a calm, measured defense of his career this time. He erupted, in a profanity-heavy monologue directed at the anonymous critics and commentators who had spent 19 years calling him the biggest bust in NFL history, at one point directly and aggressively challenging anyone still mocking him to say it to his face. It was raw, uncensored fury, delivered by a 40-year-old man who has not thrown a competitive football pass in over a decade, still visibly, furiously wounded by a label that has followed him since he was 22 years old. This isn't the language of someone who has found peace with his own story. It's the language of someone who has spent 19 years rehearsing an argument he never got to properly make in public, and finally decided he was done holding it in. JaMarcus Russell is hardly the only #1 overall pick whose post-career path wound through arrests, addiction rumors, and a long, uneven search for a second act. Another quarterback, taken second overall a decade before Russell, followed a hauntingly similar arc. National punchline, real legal trouble, years of silence, an eventual slow climb back through something other than football. What separates their stories, in the end, isn't the shape of the fall. It's what came after it. That other quarterback eventually found sobriety and a second career explaining the very game that broke him. JaMarcus Russell, as of this recording, has found none of that. He has found a legal judgment against him in his own hometown, a decades-old drug charge that was legally dismissed but never actually forgotten, a legendary blank DVD story nobody can even verify happened, and an owner's press conference that turned his entire life into a cautionary punchline without needing to say his name out loud. And he has found, apparently, an enormous amount of unresolved anger that a podcast microphone finally gave him a place to put. Now look at that photograph one final time, January 2007. Confetti falling, a crowd on its feet, a 21-year-old walking off a football field having just proven, as completely as any college quarterback ever has, exactly how good he could be. That ovation was real. Nobody was lying to him in that moment, and nobody was setting him up. For one single night, everything the state of Alabama had believed about him since he was a teenager turned out to be exactly true. Think back to where this story actually started. A 20-year-old woman in Mobile, working shifts at a shipyard, raising a son inside the gap between a family full of advanced degrees and a paycheck that came from her own two hands. Everything Russell ever did, the record-setting high school career, the national championship ring he never played for, the standing ovation in the Superdome, was supposed to close that gap for good, to convert one generation's hard, unglamorous labor into the next generation's easy, celebrated success. For one night in January of 2007, it looked like exactly that transformation had happened. It would be the last time a crowd loved him without also needing something back from him. Every crowd after that one would want a Super Bowl, or a redemption arc, or at the absolute minimum, a graceful and quiet retirement from the public eye. He has never quite given anyone any of those things, and by his own recent, furious testimony, he has no intention of starting now. Some legends get corrected once the facts catch up to them. This one hasn't been. Not really. Not yet. Because the man at the center of it is still out there, still angry, still insisting, decades later, that nobody ever really let him tell his own side. Maybe someday that changes. As of this story, it hasn't. Some men lose everything and eventually find their way to peace with it. This is the story of a man who is still fighting, out loud, for a version of the truth the rest of the world stopped listening to years ago. Next time, the story of one call that a league has spent decades trying to explain away.